Tonight, I am excited to introduce Leslie Jamison, who will be discussing her latest essay collection, Make It Scream, Make It Burn. I personally first came across Jamison's work with the empathy exams in 2014. It was one of those books that put into concise and beautiful language 100 different things that I had been feeling as a woman in 21st century America. After reading it, I wanted more, and was delighted to discover Jamison's debut novel, The Gin Closet, and later her nonfiction book on addiction, The Recovering, in addition to her essays in the New York Times Magazine, Oxford American, and The Believer. Jamison has proven her voice to be a vital one in our contemporary landscape. Her subjects range from the online game Second Life to airport layovers to one very, very lonely whale. But no matter the subject, she always circles back to the human condition. Joining her in conversation tonight is Casey Cep, the author of Furious Hours. Cep's writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, and The New Republic. Her debut, Furious Hours, explores Harper Lee's reporting on a murder investigation in 1970s Deep South and the book that Harper Lee never wrote about it. We are so happy to have them both with us tonight to discuss Make It Scream, Make It Burn. Please join me in welcoming them both to Politics and Prose.
Thank you for such a beautiful introduction, and it was really, really lovely to hear how you came to my work, and thank you all for coming. Thank you, Casey, for being here. Casey and I have known each other for a long time and could probably talk for many hours, but we'll try to keep it on topic for you guys. I was born in Washington, D.C., so it always means a lot to me to come back here to read, and I have spent many, many hours in Politics and Prose over the past 36 years. I used to come here with my aunt, and she would buy me books of poetry and huge cookies, and that felt like all one could ask of this world was like some poems and a cookie. So this place means a lot to me, and it's wonderful to be back. I'm just going to say a few words about this collection and then read a little bit from one of the essays in it. Make It Scream, Make It Burn is a collection of essays about haunting, longing, and obsession, states of reaching or mourning. It's a book about the ways we are defined by what we can't quite see or fully grasp, about the ways we are defined by what we've lost or left behind. In more tangible terms, I can say this. It includes an essay about, as Lindsay mentioned, the loneliest whale in the world, an elusive blue whale with a singularly high-pitched song, always tracked alone, and the coterie of lonely hearts who have become obsessed with him. The book includes an essay about Second Life, an online world of goth lighthouses and tropical wonderlands where a woman with MS can ride water slides and a childless woman can raise a family. It's a book about the ways in which the lives we imagine, the lives we remember from prior existences, the lives we construct for our avatars online, the lives we document in art, how these lives constitute us alongside the real lives that structure our day-to-day routines. These are essays about encounters with strangers on a Houston layover. I loved when Lindsay said one of my subjects is airport layovers. We've all been waiting for a whole book about those. On a Sri Lankan train or at a museum full of relics from broken relationships. And it's a book about how we live with the people closest to us, about the fraught intertwining of mystery and fragility that defines intimacy itself. These are essays about Civil War photography, stepmother archetypes, and Vegas hotels. This jukebox has it all. It has my whole heart. It's a heart full of faith and bruises and hope. It's a real honor to be here tonight and to be traveling around the country sharing this thing that I've done. So thank you for coming out. Tonight, I'm going to read a little bit from an essay called We Tell Ourselves Stories in Order to Live Again. And I'm going to start from the beginning, so I don't need to explain it. In April 2000, a Louisiana toddler named James Leininger started having nightmares about plane crashes. Whenever his mother came to his bedroom to comfort him, she would find his body contorted, his arms and legs flailing as if he were struggling to extricate himself from something. He repeated the same phrases again and again. Airplane crash, plane on fire, little man can't get out. Over the next few years, an increasingly specific story emerged from these dreams. James eventually told his parents they were memories from another life. He said he'd been a pilot shot down by the Japanese. He started using proper nouns that his parents couldn't account for. He'd flown a Corsair. He'd taken off from a ship called the Natoma. His parents hadn't ever talked to him about World War II and couldn't imagine where these visions were coming from. James told them about his friends on the ship, a man named Jack Larson and guys named Walter and Billy and Leon, who had all been waiting for him in heaven. He named his G.I. Joes after them. His mom, Andrea, became convinced that James was remembering another life. His father, Bruce, was more skeptical. But when Bruce started doing some research, he found pieces of information that made it hard for him to stay that way. An aircraft carrier called the Natoma Bay had been deployed near Iwo Jima in 1945. Its crew included a pilot named Jack Larson and another named James Hurston, who was shot down near Chichijima on March 3rd of that year. The crew of the Natoma Bay also included Walter Devlin and Billy Peeler and Leon Connor, all of whom perished not long before Houston himself. How would a little boy have known about these men, let alone the name of their ship and the sequence of their deaths? In 2002, Bruce went to a Natoma Bay reunion and started asking questions. He wasn't about to tell anyone what his son claimed to remember. He told everyone that he was writing a book on the history of the ship instead. Andrea, meanwhile, wasn't worried about the military history. She just wanted to end her son's nightmares. She told James that she believed him, but that his old life was over. Now he had to live this one. On a sunny January day, I visited the offices of a small research institute in Virginia called the Division of Perceptual Studies, DOPS. I was there to interview a child psychiatrist named Jim Tucker, who had spent the past 14 years compiling a database of children who claimed to remember prior lives. By the time I met Tucker, his database included more than 2,000 families, but he called James Leininger his strongest case. I was interviewing Tucker on assignment for a glossy New York magazine, and I knew my editors expected a debunking. When I told people I was writing a story about the DOPS, whose research focused on past life memories, near-death experiences, and extrasensory perception, they often said, "Wait, what?" It lent itself to easy jokes. But I felt defensive of reincarnation from the start. It wasn't that I necessarily believed in it. It was more that I'd grown deeply skeptical of skepticism itself. It seemed much easier to poke holes in things, people, programs, systems of belief, than to construct them, stand behind them, or at least take them seriously. That ready-made dismissiveness banished too much mystery and wonder. The beliefs themselves are hardly unusual. We've all wondered what happens after we die. A 2018 Pew study found that 33% of Americans believe in reincarnation, and a 2013 Harris poll estimated that 64% believe in the more loosely defined survival of the soul after death. Back home in New York, whenever I rode the subway, I saw photos of the 13-year-old autistic boy who had gone missing that October. The boy was from Queens. There was no Queens-bound train his face wasn't on. I was irrationally convinced they would find him or that he was somehow safe wherever he was. And if that conviction made me foolish, I wanted to be a fool. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to the Leiningers' home in Louisiana when I went to interview them. Driving down Louisiana back roads on my way to the Leiningers' home in Lafayette, I passed forests webbed with pockets of glistening water and shotgun shacks collapsing under their own weight. The radio in my rental car spoke to me about demons. I believe in the spiritual enemy, a man said. He works by way of substitution. Before coming down, I'd interviewed a child psychiatrist named Alan Ravitz about the possibility of past life memories, and he'd been less immediately dismissive than I'd expected. Who the hell knows, he said. Anything is possible. He admitted that Tucker had found, quote, certain sorts of phenomena that are just difficult to explain, and stressed that many of these reported past life memories weren't the typical kind of imaginative material that kids would come up with. But Ravitz posited that past lives like these could also emerge from a subtle process of reinforcement. When a kid tells a story or recounts an odd memory or a weird dream that felt real and gets any kind of attention for it, it's only natural for the child to keep expanding it. These dynamics of reinforcement, maybe operating for parents and children alike, were part of what fascinated me about these cases. We tell stories about why we're lonely or what we're haunted by, and these stories about absence can define us as fully as our present realities. Kids build identities around ghosts. A mother believes that her son has trouble making friends because the soul of an old man lives inside him. Stories about past lives help explain this one. They promise an extraordinary root structure beneath the ordinary soil of our days. They acknowledge that the realities closest to us, the rhythms of our lives, the people we love most, are shaped by forces beyond the edges of our sight. It's thrilling and terrifying. It's expansion and surrender at once. The Leiningers lived in a modest house shadowed by river birches draped in Spanish moss. When Bruce answered the door, he offered me a cup of coffee and a slice of banana bread, then, almost immediately, offered to show me his gun collection. I could tell it made him wary to see me writing in my notebook. "I'm not a gun nut," he said, holding a gun in each hand. After I used the bathroom, I emerged to find a collection of bullets spread across his comforter. I didn't want to touch them, but I mentally recorded them as a, quote, telling detail. The tattoo that ran along my arm was posing questions about this man, this moment, and these bullets. Homo sum, humani nil a me alienum puto, it said. I am human. Nothing human is alien to me. Had I been foolishly unwilling to acknowledge that some people were alien to me? Did I need to identify with all the gun-loving men of this world? Was it naive or even ethically irresponsible to believe I should find common ground with everyone or that it was even possible? In preparation for my arrival, Bruce had pulled out his material about the Natoma Bay and its pilots, more than a decade's worth of research. The dining room table was covered with notebooks and folders, but it was, quote, only a fraction, he said, of what he had in his closets. He had compiled a separate notebook for every single soldier who died on the ship, crammed with as much biographical information and as many military after-action reports as he could assemble. There was a wooden champagne crate full of microfiche reels that the ship's historian had sent him. Bruce freely admitted, I was obsessed. I'm going to skip to just read the final few pages of the essay. But yeah, I spent some time with the Leiningers and became really interested obviously in the kind of core question of like, had James Leininger actually been a World War II Navy pilot? But really more interested in what did it mean to his family to believe that he had been, because it had clearly structured this family's entire sense of themselves, their son's psyche. They had built really a collective life around this memory. And it was that attachment and that kind of collective attachment and the question of kind of what sense of a self does it ask you to believe in if you believe in reincarnation that ultimately became the kind of driving forces for me as I spent more and more time with them. Before I left, Andrea handed me a composition James had written in 7th grade called Nightmares. The burning torture of fire and smoke hit me every single night for 5 years. The nightmares were not dreams, but something that actually happened. The death of James M. Houston. His soul was brought back in the human form. He was brought back in my body, and he chose to come back to Earth for a reason, to tell people that life is truly everlasting. The specter of skepticism haunted this crescendo, and James was wise to it. You can think I am a fool for knowing this, for believing these things. But when my parents wrote the book about me and my story, people who were deathly ill or had incurable diseases sent me emails that said, "Your story helped me and made me not afraid to die." At the bottom of James's composition, his teacher had written just one word 3 times in red. Wow, wow, wow. A few months after I returned from Louisiana, I got a letter from my aunt. She had just spent the afternoon with my grandfather, a former chemical engineer a few months shy of his 100th birthday. They had been talking about the possibility of reincarnation. For my grandfather, the first in his family to go to college and a deeply rational man his whole life, the question of what came next was no longer abstract. He and my aunt had eaten salmon and potatoes, solid foods that reminded you that your body was still yours, while he sketched out his vision of living and dying. Quote, "We pick up a piece of consciousness when we are born, and when we die, it goes back to where it came from." That same week, a magazine fact checker was filling my inbox with his skepticism every day. He informed me that more than one World War II aircraft carrier had a Walter and a Leon and a Billy on its crew, so the names were probably just coincidence, and that no Corsairs had ever flown from the Natoma Bay. Some part of me wanted to get into it, to tell him that maybe there never were Corsairs flying from the Natoma, but James Houston had been one of only 20 pilots flying Corsairs as part of an experimental team earlier in the war. There's photographic evidence, I wanted to shout, like a proper Bruce Leininger acolyte. But my defensiveness had never really been about the facts. It had always been about the vision. The most compelling question for me had never been, is reincarnation real? It had always been, what vision of the self does reincarnation ask us to believe in? I found something appealing about the vision of selfhood it suggested, porous and unoriginal. It was deeply related to what I loved about 12-step recovery, that it asked me to understand myself as interchangeable, to see my dilemmas as shared and my identity as something oddly and inescapably connected to distant strangers. Recovery was another story of reincarnation, after all, the sober self reborn from its drunken past. It was as if reincarnation made explicit the philosophical premise underneath recovery itself. If recovery said, your soul isn't this special thing, then reincarnation said, your soul isn't even yours. If recovery said, you could have been this other person, then reincarnation said, you actually were this other person. And if reincarnation is a story some people find comforting, then it's also true that the soul is just a story too. The notion of an essential, singular self in each of us. Reincarnation both buffers this belief and disrupts it. What we call our soul doesn't die, but perhaps it was never ours. Ultimately, this is what appealed to me about the story of reincarnation, that it asked me to believe in a self without rigid boundaries, a self that had lived before and would do it again. In this way, it was a metaphor for what I was struggling to accept about living at all, that nothing we lived was unique, that we were always, in some sense, living again. Reincarnation is an assertion of contingency. I could have been anyone. Maybe I was a nurse or a hitman or a mean guy or a hero. Maybe I was a colonial explorer, a colonized subject, a queen or a sailor. It's humble and it's the opposite of humility, the same way people can read my tattoo as empathy or arrogance. Nothing human is alien to me. In all my wrestling with reincarnation, I'd been looking for a way to get humble in the face of consciousness, to be the teacher writing wow, 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 rather than giving a letter grade. Reincarnation struck me as an articulation of faith in the self as something that could transform and stay continuous at once, in sobriety, in love, in the body of a stranger. This faith believes a 13-year-old boy in Queens might not be lost for good. This faith says, come back to Lafayette, to Virginia, to Myanmar. Come back with scars telling a story no one understands, to a lawn full of crumpled plastic reindeer or a house overlooking skeletal winter trees, to a jet mechanic throwing sticks for the dogs, a man who refuses to believe you were ever a lost boy in Long Island City. Come back to some suburb off the interstate, some condo, some row house. Come back remembering so you can tell us where you've been. We want to know. We watch a little boy wear his cowboy boots to the pool. We watch a little man who can't get out. We watch the past fill the present like smoke, the memory of sisters and parachutes and flames. We say, wow. We say it again. We stay humble. We can't know for sure until the body turns up in the river, and even then it might not be the end. We walk toward the lights. We are safe, or else we aren't. We live until we don't. We return unless we can't. Thanks.
Wow.
I really set you up for that one,
that's nice. Look, I think I had a million questions. I didn't know you were going to read from the reincarnation essay, but I feel like on behalf of everyone here, do you believe in reincarnation and or do you specifically believe what this family claims about James's experience? I promise we'll get to the meta nitty-gritty, crafty stuff, but I feel like the provocation here is, did you change your mind and what's your kind of assessment of this family?
I mean, this is probably a good embodiment also of some of our conversations too, where I sort of try to feint away from the core question with all my abstraction. You're like, but was he a World War II pilot or not? I mean, I guess the honest answer is that I do believe that something inside of us survives past the death of our mortal bodies. But I'm not at all sure that it's so literal as like you were once a Navy pilot and then you become a teenage boy in Louisiana. I think, but I really think, so like I wouldn't say 100% like he was that pilot or I came away believing that he was that pilot. But I also feel really strongly that I don't want to, like, I have no desire to insist that can't be the case, that it can't be the case. I think what I did end up feeling was that Jim Tucker, the child psychiatrist, who's actually a much larger part of the piece, but I didn't read that much about my engagement with him, the guy who's in Virginia assembling the database of kids with past life memories.
Because you chose one specific to investigate, but there are many others he's built into his own database.
Yeah.
Right?
And we went to visit a couple of families together. And so I think a little bit about them in these pages. But I focused on James in part because he said James was his strongest case. So it seemed like if there was going to be something that might compel you to believe, like if this guy was saying this is my A+, I was going to look hard at that. But Jim Tucker has a whole theory of how reincarnation works. And I didn't necessarily find compelling. It's kind of, I mean, it tries to map out in terms of the physics, a kind of scientific rationale for how this would happen. And I feel like the closer you look at that, the less compelling it seems. And, you know, I talked to a couple of physicists who felt that way as well. So it seems like if you try to understand or provide some like quantifiable account of how it works, then it feels like the thing falls apart. But when I get a little bit more soft focus and think, are there things that remain beyond my understanding? That feels like more where I can, that feels like what I can get behind.
Sure. And I feel like for those of us who really know and love your work, we hear echoes of the Morgellons essay. You know, here's a writer who tries to take seriously, even to suspend her own disbelief and judgment and scrutiny in order to understand where people are. And I guess I'm wondering, on this side of the essay, it feels very obvious to me you could make it into a Leslie Jamison essay. At what point in your research or reporting do you decide this is an essay for me? You know, this idea, because we heard in there that was an assignment. You know, I'm sure people bring you ideas all the time. You read things. Where do you, at what point in your research, make that determination of, you know, this is me. I can get into my core themes here. I can use my method.
Yeah, well, it's right on to connect it to the Morgellons piece, which, not to assume that everybody here has read my work, but the Morgellons essay is an essay called The Devil's Bait from my first collection, the Empathy Exams. And it's about this controversial skin disease called Morgellons. Patients who experience Morgellons describe lots of sort of itching and burning sensations, but their most distinct symptom is unexplainable threads and fibers emerging through their skin from inside of their bodies. But most doctors think of it as would categorize it as like a psychosomatic illness. And so absolutely, as Casey's referencing, like I approached the subject of Morgellons less as a doctor trying to figure out, is this real or not, and more interested in questions like, how do people who identify as suffering from Morgellons like form this community? What do they get out of a kind of collective existence as Morgellons patients? And also as a sort of an onlooker, why do we think of some kinds of pain as more legitimate than others? Like, why would they be suffering from something more real if there were threads coming out of their skin than if there weren't? And there's an absolute connection between the two of them, because the editor who came to me with this idea said, I read your Morgellons piece and it seemed like reincarnation might be a subject that you could approach with, I can't remember the phrase she used, but the phrase I've substituted in memory is like a kind of interrogative agnosticism, like to be willing to suspend some kind of immediate judgment, but to also try to dig deep into the thing rather than taking it at face value. And I had an immediate feeling that I was drawn to this story, in part just because reincarnation is really interesting. But it was only partway through that I started to understand this distinction between the most compelling question being, is reincarnation real? For me, at least, that wasn't the most compelling question. The most compelling question was like, what does it suggest about our understanding of the self to believing reincarnation? And maybe one way into that question for me was like, why do I feel so defensive of these families? Like other people in my life, when I was writing this piece, when I was revising this piece, would say, well, they just kind of seem like hucksters, you know, like they have this story about their son. They've like been on TV about it. They wrote this book about it, like just this kind of real skepticism. And I felt sort of protective of their faith in reincarnation. I felt protective of that belief system. And so the question of like, why did I want to protect it, or what did I find kind of beautiful about it, ultimately did become, in some of the passages that I read, like really part of the subject of the piece. But it was like many layers to get there. So the piece had a kind of a fraught history where it was commissioned by New York Magazine, who then did not like what I wrote was not what they were imagining me writing. So they killed the piece. And then it found a home in Harper's, which was
a new life, really.
It had a second life. Yeah, it was reincarnated in Harper's. And they were kind of down for a piece that wasn't necessarily just like a kind of a takedown piece. But really it took another like 4 years to write the piece that was really waiting for me, I think, in that subject, which is this version of the piece, in which I'm really able to kind of get at the questions underneath the phenomenon rather than just documenting the phenomenon itself. And part of that involved letting a little bit more of myself into the piece. The version that ran at Harper's had almost no I in it. And I don't think an I is always necessary to a piece, but here, thinking about that question of like, what was I feeling so defensive about, actually felt like it was a way into some of the thornier kind of conceptual thickets that were at play too.
Sure. And you gave us a nice sense of just how diverse this collection is. You talk about a lot of different subjects. And I was particularly struck, though, in the final third of the book that it takes this personal turn. And yet even there's a kind of multiplicity of selves. So you write about being a stepmother. You write about having a daughter. You write about being a daughter and a granddaughter. And I wonder for you, is it the same thing? Do you use that same outward-facing method on yourself? Because the I is consistent. It's always you, but you're inhabiting these very different roles just the way you are as journalist, researcher, academic, that sort of thing. Does it feel like the same project of exploration when it's just your own life?
Yeah. I mean, some of the methods are different, but in terms of the kinds of questions that I'm asking, and the kind of, especially that process of trying to kind of dig underneath the story again and again to find the like messier tangle underneath, like that process absolutely feels shared between more reported pieces and more personal pieces. And I think really that connection around paying attention to multiple selves and manifesting in the writing itself a kind of multiplicity of selfhood is real, because I think so many of the reported pieces that I'm looking at are looking at some version of like, how can somebody be many things at once? How can a little boy in Louisiana maybe hold the ghost of a fighter pilot in this like literal way? How can a mother of 4 in Atlanta who works 9 to 5 in a call center also hold her digital avatar, who's this like, you know, young, buxom, blonde woman who just lounges around in her bed and her pool all day? How is that like fake constructed self also part of that mom in that Atlanta call center? And I think that is a motivating curiosity for me when I look at other people's lives. Like, how do you hold, you know, like in a Whitman way, how do you contain multitudes? And I think that was very much at play in some of the personal pieces as well. Like, how do I hold the potential for these various selves, like the self who is both formed by a relationship that ended 5 years ago and is a stepmother and is a mother and is, you know, trying to figure out how to be inside of these domestic intimacies while holding all the selves that she's been before. I think it's the terrain is different when it's your life, and the charge of it is kind of different, but that is certainly one of the connective tissues that I see in the collection, is that sense of like, how is everybody always many things at the same time?
So it sounds like a really distinctive project and not one that everybody kind of in the contemporary culture is engaged in, because it requires patience with yourself and other people, and it requires a kind of openness, right, to multiplicity, and the kind of anti-reductive posture of, well, this is your job and this is who you are, or you said this one thing and it represents you. Has that always felt like the Leslie Jamison method? You know, if we go look at your diaries from age 11, are you looking around at your family and realizing, well, my older brother is also my mother's son, or is that something that your work kind of brought you to? Or life forced you to realize about yourself?
I think I'm thinking about my 11-year-old self.
I've actually
my
seen
11-year-old
Leslie's 11-year-old diaries, so this is a plant of a question. But
yeah, I definitely think there was I think there was a little bit more of like reducing my brother, say, to like just the person who wouldn't speak to me on a given Sunday afternoon, rather than being able to see him in all of these other iterations of his self at the same time. But I do think, you know, one thing that I think has always been there, and that you can probably see traces of in those diaries as well, is like, I'm very interested in these moments of glitch, I guess, where you see, or you feel like you're seeing some glimpse of a person's secret or hidden self, where there's some sort of rupture in the seamless texture of them just like going about the day, or sort of being on, or being confident or assured, or, you know, and where you see like something else flash up from inside of them, whether it's like a moment of friction or a moment of uncertainty or a moment of kind of passionate adoration that seems to like sort of bubble up. Like I'm thinking about with my brother, who both of my brothers are actually quite reserved. But my middle brother, who's very reserved, would sometimes have these very effusive reactions to movies that he loved or music that he loved. He loved Bruce Springsteen. He loved Star Wars. And in those moments of kind of getting really excited about something, those also kind of felt like glitch moments where you're seeing his like secret life. And you do have to be kind of patient sometimes to wait for the glitch moments to arrive, or wait for those glimpses, little vista moments where you see the kind of private, secret part of a person emerge. And I think those are also like things that I'm interested, say, with Second Life, thinking about people's digital avatars as an expression of some secret or hidden self, in the same way that like my brother loving Bruce Springsteen so hard was like a self inside of him that wasn't always exposed to the light of day.
Sure. Well, it makes you sound a bit like a photographer, and I'm mindful in this collection there's so much visual art, and you spend a lot of time with some photographers learning about their methods, the idea that you're kind of waiting to capture some part of someone that maybe even they don't realize is a certain part of them. And I'm wondering, and you can tell us maybe a little bit about where the title comes from and the kinds of photography and visual disciplines you're interested in, but just whether that was also something that affected your writing style or just fed you as an artist. And if so, maybe for the benefit of us here, who are those artists you learned from in that way? How to pay attention.
Yeah. I mean, so when you were talking about patience earlier, and the kind of process of showing up, I was definitely thinking about one of the artists who I write about in these pages, who's not actually one of the, there's some well-known people who show up in here, James Agee and Susan Sontag and Joan Didion, who's famous. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. I repurposed to we tell ourselves stories in order to live again, which was really, there are sometimes the kind of vendetta moments in a book where you see the things that the magazine didn't let the writer do, where I was like, now I can finally call this essay the thing I wanted to call.
In the Word document all along.
I know, since 2013 on my hard drive. But I think the essay that summons the idea of patience most forcefully here is this essay called Maximum Exposure, about a photographer named Annie Appel, who is she's a bit of an outsider artist. She's never really received any institutional funding, but even without that support or recognition, she's been engaged in this one project for now almost 30 years that I became totally fascinated by. This she's been photographing the same family, a Mexican family, for almost 3 decades now. The members of the family live on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border, and she very much does this thing in trip after trip and sort of prolonged encounter after prolonged encounter. She's waiting for those moments of glitch, or those moments of exposure, or those moments, I loved how you put it, where you maybe see something about somebody that they can't quite see about themselves or aren't fully conscious of in themselves. And I think that's another way to think about what often gets framed in very antagonistic terms when we're talking about the journalist's relationship with a subject, or even a photographer's relationship with a subject, that they're sort of out to get them or see around them, and that's kind of an aggressive act. At one point in the essay I read from, I'm thinking about Jim Tucker, this child psychiatrist, and sort of preemptively feeling guilty because I know that I'm going to tell a story about him that's not the story he would tell about himself. And so I think there can be a kind of arrogance in being the artist who thinks, oh, I know something about this person they don't know about themselves, or I see something about them they don't know about themselves. But there's also a real sense of artistic possibility in that you can kind of capture something. And in the case of Annie and her art practice, it's really about showing up over and over again for decades and decades to kind of find those moments where something becomes visible. And for every moment where something becomes visible, you had to show up for, 50 moments where it wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we all know and love that kind of tenderness about your vision for the people and the places and the things you write about. And I'm going to open it up to questions, but I just have one final one, which is you bring that warmth and generosity to everything you write about. But I'm so curious, writers are like, not parents. You can play favorites. Is there someone in this collection, there's family, there's friends, there's Annie, there's James Agee, it doesn't have to be someone you personally met, but someone you're in conversation with in this book who's a particular favorite or was especially meaningful to you at the start or once you finished writing about them?
Yeah. I have a couple answers to that question. And when you were talking about parents not playing favorites, one thing that I actually decided to do for this tour that I've never done before is there are 14 essays in the collection, and I'm going to read a different one at each stop on the tour, in part because I wanted to.
They're all great, but we got a especially great one. I think
You
the
guys got a good
Reincarnation
one.
one is fun. Yeah.
I kind of wanted to give all my children a time on the stage. That said, really the most immediate answer to your question, but it's kind of a cheat, so I will give another answer, is the last essay in the collection is both about and addressed to my daughter, and it's an essay about pregnancy and birth. She's probably my favorite person.
Yeah, fair
in the
enough.
collection,
You can,
but
Now give us another one. You're right.
No,
you owe us
I know.
one more.
I know. I'm thinking if we only had the AV set up, so I could just segue into just playing videos of her stacking blocks behind us.
It's a great essay, I should say. You say that as if it's not a fraught essay in its own right. It's very beautiful and complicated and rich essay, but I'm still going to put you on the spot for one more who's not, the progeny of your womb.
I have a kind of affection for a lot of people, but the other person who really came to mind very forcefully is a woman named Leonora, who appears in the first essay in the collection, which is called 52 Blue, about the loneliest whale in the world. And Leonora is one of these people who I mentioned earlier who has become kind of obsessed with this whale. And in Leonora's case, she became quite interested in 52 Blue when she was recovering from a coma and having to go through, she really had to relearn so many things. She had to learn again how to walk. She had to learn again how to talk. And when she encountered the story of 52 Blue, I think that whale, or what she projected onto the whale, really spoke to the way that she felt very apart from the rest of humanity. She felt like she was sort of learning how to be a person again. And seeing the role that this whale had played in Leonora's life was quite moving to me. And I ended up going to this art show at a community center in Harlem where she lived, and seeing the kind of end of that essay involves seeing this painting that she had made of the whale, where she's a sort of version of herself is riding this whale like across a rainbow. And it sounds a little cheesy when I say it like that, and it is a little bit, there is something about it that's like so sentimental, but when you contextualize it inside the longer arc of this woman being in this 8-week coma and trying to figure out how to live again on the other side of it, and the role that the whale played in that arc of trying to figure out how to live, I just had this deep feeling of sort of compassion for her and finding the sort of beauty in her story. And there's a weird echo actually between my cheat answer to that question and my Leonora answer to that question, which is that one of the things that's fun about putting essays into a collection is that they say things to each other that they can't say on their own. And one small version of that is that Leonora, in our final encounter in that first essay, says to me, she says, "Vaya con Dios, you should have a baby someday." And I don't know why she said it still. I think she was doing a lot of thinking about making things and what we sort of leave behind. But I like the way that is the first essay here, and it sort of calls out to that final essay where I obey her prophecy.
Yeah, that's so great. And people should feel free to queue up for questions. I will just say, if you're a Leslie fan and you've encountered any of these as one-offs in many of the wonderful publications she writes for, it's truly like an album. Even if you've heard the single, you're going to want to read the album. So please pick it up tonight. But we should start taking questions from the room.
Your discussant referenced your...
Oh, he's at the microphone. He's there, but it must not be... Maybe come to this one.
I've got a lot of projection though, so...
I think she wants
it's
it for
just
the recording.
for the benefit of recording.
Okay, that
The
one is
internet
working.
will know
Is
your
it?
question.
All right.
We're speaking into that other one.
Oh, this one is certainly hopping. Your discussant referenced your core themes. How would you define them?
Yeah. So I think in this collection, certainly that kind of trio of ideas of obsession and haunting and longing do really feel like the core of this book to me. And all three of those describes some state of being in the thrall of something that's kind of at a distance that you can't quite hold or can't quite see. So if you're haunted by something that you've lost or that is no longer with us, or you're longing for something that you can't quite have, or you're obsessed with something that you can't quite fully understand or get a grip on. And I think it's those states of sort of reaching towards but not quite having that are quite interesting to me in this book. But I also think this book is a kind of continuation of longer term obsessions or core themes, including kind of what it means to empathize with or try to understand other people, and what the limits of that are, what the limits of empathy are, where it kind of becomes impossible, and how important it is to respect and acknowledge that impossibility as well. And kind of relatedly, the urge to represent and also the limits of representation. So I think part of why this book is a lot about art is it's thinking about the kind of fantasy of representing another person or an aspect of your emotional life in a complete, comprehensive way, but it can't ever be complete. It can't ever be full. At one point, when I'm thinking about Annie working for 30 years on this photography project, I reference that Borges fable that many people might be familiar with, the idea that if you had a map that showed everything about the world, it would have to be as large as the world. And that to me is this really potent, beautiful summoning of the kind of fantasy of representational completeness, and also the kind of impossibility at the core of that fantasy.
Great, thanks.
Hi. I think to start with, I want to say I feel really grateful for your work as a young woman. I think over the years I've been reading a lot of what you did. I think everything almost, and it's been. I think I appreciate your brilliance. But really, as a woman, I think it's really important to have you. And I'm from Austria, and I can also tell you that, across in Europe, people read you and people love your work. Maybe, you probably already know that, but I can attest to that.
Say more, yeah.
My question really is, you in your work, you really put yourself out there in such extreme ways, and you've been so raw almost and open. And I'm trying to understand, like, what was that process like for you? What did it take for you to open up like that? Did you decide that from one day to the next, or was that a process? And also, how does it change now that you're a mother, and like that, do you want to be, are you more protective of certain, spaces in your life now? And that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you. I had wanted to ask her that, but I ran out of time.
But you couldn't have said that cool thing about Europe. So, first of all, thank you so much. It really, really means a lot to hear that the work has meant something to you. So thank you for saying that. And yeah, I love the way that you asked that question, and I love that you invoke the idea of process, because I think that's really at the center of my answer to the question of what it means to me to like invoke my life and what I've lived in the work that I do. Is that it really feels like a process. And I mean that in a really craft-based way, where it's like every time I write an essay that involves personal experience, it's almost always like a 2 or 3 year process of drafting and revising and revising and revising. And I think part of why that feels so, there are a couple reasons at least that feels so essential, especially when the work is personal. And the first is that I think we can have this belief that we're sort of infinitely and immediately available to ourselves, that we sort of know ourselves or we know what we've lived. But to me, it's like the only personal experiences that are worth writing about are the ones I kind of don't understand or have something left that I still need to figure out about them. And so often that process of drafting and revising is about finding, I'm thinking about that beautiful James Baldwin quote where he says that, you can probably correct my terrible paraphrase of it, but that one of the functions of art is to reveal the questions that have been hidden by the answers. And I think there's a way that really applies to personal experience, where it's like I can maybe in a first draft, I'll tell the version of an experience that I think of as like the cocktail party anecdote or something. And I just mean by that the kind of reductive, maybe slightly glib, the easy grooves of narrative we have about, well, this is why that breakup happened, or this is, my pathology about my dad, or something, that's like kind of reduces it. And that part of what it means to revise is to like dig underneath that smooth, overhandled stone of the reductive version and tell the messier thing underneath. And so the drafting is really in service of excavating more and more complexity from the experience. But the other thing it does is it means that by the time the work goes out into the world, I've shaped and reshaped it so many times. It's not that it's become inauthentic or even that I have some kind of clinical distance from it. It's still something that I've lived, but I experience it and have a long-term experience with it also as a sculpted thing, a crafted text. So it feels very different from... I guess in that sense, it feels much more cooked than raw, and it feels much more made than exposed. And so I think that idea of process is really at the core of that as well. And in relation to the last part of your question about motherhood, yes, I think I'm still thinking through a lot of those questions. Conveniently, the last essay here ends with my daughter's birth. So I think that maybe that's the moment at which... the question of what needs to be protected in her experience. It is a question that I think about, and absolutely when I, in the writing that I've done about my stepdaughter or in the writing that I've done about pregnancy, I think there's a sharpened version of what's always true, which is that there are many, many things that I don't write about and will never write about. And I think when people read the work, they can feel like you write about everything because the only things they know about are the things that you write about. But of course, there are all the things that aren't there that they don't know have been left out.
Hi. I'm so happy you're here also. It means a lot. And yeah, maybe this will be a little bit redundant, but I am so taken by how much you hold in your pieces, the multitudes you say, and I really like the Emerson quote, or maybe it's a you quote responding to Emerson in one of your new essays about how making a story, specifically a story about nature, can be a violence and a beauty, and just needing to hold the messiness. But you're also a teacher, and I'm trying to move more into seeing myself as a teacher than a student, or both at the same time. And I'm wondering how you see that play out in your process of teaching, how you kind of deal in coherence in a setting that demands a level of coherence, and if you can talk to about the different age levels that you've seen that working too. Yeah.
I love that. I love that question. Because my life as a teacher both means a tremendous amount to me and feels deeply connected to my life as a writer. Like they're in constant conversation. So I teach right now. I teach at the Columbia University School of the Arts at the in the MFA program there, where I've been for about 5 years. And my students are graduate students, and they range from a young 22 to, students in their 60s or 70s. And I love working with that community in particular because it's not one thing, but many things to sort of continue that theme. My students are coming from all sorts of backgrounds, both in terms of what they've lived, what jobs they've had, where they're from, their class backgrounds, their racial backgrounds. There are many, many international students end up at Columbia. So it feels like even by the time we all step into the classroom, even before all the things that happen in a classroom have happened to us, where we start to create this communal conversation and we have these pieces of language that belong to us that we're sort of passing back and forth. Even before all of that, there's so much being brought to the room and so many different things being brought to the room, which is deeply exciting. Craft-wise, I feel very strongly that I'm still wrestling with so many of the things that my students are wrestling with, but that doesn't mean I don't have anything to say to them. So the fact that things are still challenges to me that they're struggling with. Like, how do you excavate from the specifics of an experience something that might matter or be meaningful beyond the specifics of that experience, right? Like, that's one of the biggest questions I think that comes up with personal narrative, how to make it matter beyond itself, without sort of browbeating or insisting or moralizing. And it's less that I'm like, well, I've settled this question and now I'll let you guys know. And more that, I wrestle with it each time I return to my computer, each time I return to an essay, but I can speak to them about the thoughts I've had over the course of the past 15 years of wrestling, and hopefully there's something useful in those thoughts. But I mean, I joke with them all the time. I try to be pretty self-conscious about the fact that, we're all having the same epiphanies all over and over again. And so, at a certain point, actually a couple of semesters ago, I realized that I had told my students to get specific so many times because they would so often, especially when they had some level of shame about a story, shame because they thought it was overly familiar, shame because they thought it was redundant, shame because it felt like too small to merit speaking or articulation, that they would kind of get really vague about it or really soft focus. And I would say the more soft focus you get, the less worth reading it is. Like, the more you glide over the breakup story because you think it's just a breakup story, the more it becomes just a breakup story because you haven't gotten into the grit and tangle of it. Anyway, I realized I was saying get specific so many times that I ended up bringing them a chocolate cake on the last day of class that just said get specific on top, because I was like, if you take one thing away from this course, like, let it be that. And I know I say it over and over again. But I think when I brought that cake in, one of the students was he was so delighted because he told me that they actually had a drinking game the whole class where they would, whenever they were together and somebody would say a word that was like a Leslie word, like specific, consciousness, granular, they would all have to like take a drink. And I feel like that was a pretty accurate summary of my pedagogy.
Now I want to make the list.
Totally. I know, and it's funny because I would be the only person there who couldn't take a drink, but I guess I would just keep providing the multisyllabic so that everybody else could get a good buzz on. But
could we take one more? I'm going to interrupt with just one, though, on that subject. Do you think you would ever do a collection that's more kind of craft-oriented? You have this wealth of experience teaching, and obviously a lot of us here would like to learn from you in a way that we probably can't because we won't be able to enroll in the MFA program or the PhD program. But is that something you've ever thought about?
It's interesting. The idea of just writing a craft book on my own, I guess I haven't ever seriously thought about, or maybe would think about, like, after I have more years of doing this thing under my belt. But I was recently having a conversation with an editor who works with a good friend of mine who's also a writer and very smart lady. And the editor said, oh, you and Robin should write a craft book together that's just the two of you writing letters back and forth to each other about craft. And it was interesting because actually that idea appealed to me immensely when the craft book was framed as a conversation between two minds rather than just one mind speaking. It somehow got a kind of energy. And so what I actually told her was that Robin and I have many of our best conversations in hot tubs. And so she was like, oh, well, Scribner will provide the hot tub. But I love that idea of both the idea of writing a book that was a conversation and that could allow you to access questions of craft with a kind of dynamic energy that if it was just your mind speaking to itself, you might not find.
Sure. Well, one more act of dynamic energy. Let's get the last question, and then obviously folks stay around to get your book signs, and they have all of Leslie's earlier works too. And truly, I want to put
Casey's book too, Furious Hours.
But there's a connection between our books, which if you have not read, The Gin Closet, there are two irascible cats with great names related to Harper Lee in it. So pick up the novel before you leave.
You talked a lot about how people create their belief system. So I wanted to ask you about how you form your own personal belief system. Do you need sort of empirical evidence for the things that you believe in, or are you looking for a belief system that's simply useful to you, that's sort of a story that allows you to live, the story that you tell yourself in order to live?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that my beliefs are often more they often have their origins in a sense of intuition or a kind of a gut feeling, and do definitely partake in that logic of like what beliefs are useful to me in order to survive my own life. But that said, I do think that even though I think and talk a lot about sort of pushing back against knee-jerk skepticism or remaining open to or agnostic about things that other people might easily dismiss, I do think that my mind is kind of a critical mind in certain ways. Like I'm constantly interrogating things. So I think that I guess I would describe a lot of my beliefs as things that I have decided make for good ways of living or being around care for other people and a sense of sort of showing up for relationships, a sense of sort of showing up to be a part of collective life with strangers and intimates in a way that acknowledges that I owe others something. So I think there's a way that I have crafted beliefs around what I think makes for a good life, but that I'm constantly like interrogating the things that I believe. And so there's a sense of both embracing something, but not embracing it in this blind way that sort of elides or tries to airbrush out all the things that are difficult about it, but sort of like, I guess, questioning something and trying to hew to it around that questioning or within that questioning. I guess I'm not wanting to use the word despite that questioning, because I feel like the questioning can be very much a part of believing in something rather than the opposite of believing in something. So it's that kind of it's a kind of commitment that can also hold that act of interrogation.
So we're going to add a practical ethics to the list of books that we're expecting from Leslie Jamison in the near future. Thanks so much for coming in. Please buy the book right here at Politics and Prose.